Okay, so the passage we're looking at this evening is Joshua chapter 8. And in a sense, part of the problem that we face now is we're sort of jumping into the middle of a single narrative. Last week, we thought about chapter 7. Joshua sends part of the army to attack the city or town of Ai and is defeated. They figure out why, which is because Achan has stolen some of the spoil from Jericho, the previous chapter, and then are defeated. So kind of part of the challenge we have is to sort of pick up into the middle of the flow, the middle of the story, and get ourselves back into the flow again. I was thinking this morning, in our morning service, we're listening to Jonah chapter 3. I was thinking that in some ways, without having gone through all that took place last week in Joshua 7, actually, Jonah 3 does set us up quite nicely for this evening. Jonah, one of the key verses in Jonah 3 is verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, that in spite of his disobedience, God is not done with Jonah, and the plan continues on, which is exactly how our passage starts this evening. You could paraphrase it as the word of the Lord comes to Joshua and says, let's try this again. So morning and evening, we're both thinking about the God of the second chance. The God who can't be defeated by our disobedience, the God who can be trusted to continue to work in us and through us. So if we hold that kind of thought in mind as we work through Joshua 8, we won't go too far wrong. Now, Joshua 8 divides into two sections of unequal length. The first section, verses 1 to 29, tell the story of the conquest of Ai. Ai, the city, not as in... There's a misheard conversation in our house earlier on, thinking about AI tonight. That is not artificial intelligence. That is the city of Ai. Then the second bit of the chapter we have, chapter 8, verses 30 to 35, with no warning, the writer jumps us about 20 miles further north, and rather than the conquest of Ai, we're now looking at two mountains further away and the renewing of the covenant. So, because I want to actually spend time looking at both of those things, I'm not going to read the whole of chapter 8 through. I want to give the second section the time it deserves. But I will read a bit from Joshua 8 and verse 1. And I just want to read down Joshua 8 verse 1 down to verse 9. And then we're going to focus in on verses 1 and 2, because that really contains in many ways, all the information I think we need to start off with anyway. Anyway, Joshua 8 verse 1. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai and his people, his city and his land. And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoil and its livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. Lay an ambush against the city behind it." So Joshua and all the fighting men arose to go up to Ai. And Joshua chose 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them out by night. And he commanded them, "Behold, you shall lie in ambush against the city behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you remain ready. I and all the people who are with me will approach the city. When they come out against us just as before, we shall flee before them, and they will come out after us until we have drawn them away from the city. For they will say, 'They are fleeing from us just as before.' So we will flee before them. Then you shall rise up from the ambush and seize the city, for the Lord your God will give it into your hand. As soon as you have taken the city, you shall set the city on fire. You shall do according to the word of the Lord. See, I have commanded you." So Joshua sent them out, and they went to the place of ambush that lay between Bethel and Ai, to the west of Ai. But Joshua spent that night among the people. Now, there's lots more to that story that we could run through, and there's plenty of things to learn from that, but I'm not going to go into all that detail for this. Suffice to say, in the next 20 verses, everything goes according to plan. Ai is defeated. It's a pretty graphic story, but that's how things were in those days and at that point. The two verses I really want to focus on are these two. Verses 1 and 2. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai and his people, his city and his land. And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoil and its livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. Lay an ambush against the city behind it." Now, in many ways, that those two verses contain all we need to know to really get our heads around the whole chapter. There's instructions there for Joshua, lay an ambush, which then Joshua expands and takes and converts that into a plan which they work through. But just try to think, as you start the chapter, I mean, chapter 7 has run through, they've been defeated once, Achan has been identified as the culprit behind it, he and his whole family have died. And you can imagine a whole heap of questions rolling around Joshua's mind. Achan's been dealt with, but where do we stand now? Is God still with us? How do we encourage the people? But this is not a professional army that we're looking at, but how do you encourage them after they've been defeated? What is the plan now? And I find it encouraging that as you start the chapter, God in his graciousness does not leave Joshua wondering any of these things. It's God who speaks first. God reassures Joshua, don't fear, don't be dismayed, and he promises him victory. And what Joshua most needs to know is affirmed in these two verses. God is still with them, God will give them the land, and there is a way forwards. I just think within these first couple of verses, I think there are two things that we really should grasp as we try and work our way through Joshua and through chapters 7 and 8. Now, firstly, we should note there's a difference in the instructions regarding Jericho as regarding Ai. So when they were to attack Jericho, in 6 verse 19, God said this, all silver and gold and every vessel of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord and shall go into the treasury of the Lord. But then when you get to Ai here, it's spoil and livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. So there's a difference here. Now, firstly, that makes chapter 7 in many ways look even more tragic and pointless. If Achan had waited a few days longer, he would have had all the things he was after. All the things he took for himself that cost victory at Ai the first time and led to all the problems of chapter 7, in many ways were just unnecessary. He didn't have to miss out on these things. God didn't say that in Jericho because God was in some way hoarding for himself all the best things. God had always intended to provide for his people. They just had to wait until God gave them permission to take the spoil. But Achan couldn't do that. He couldn't wait. He took at Jericho, the whole people suffered, and then here in chapter 8, you get this instruction. It's okay, the spoil, the livestock, it's yours. You can take it if you want. Now, last week we thought a little bit about what Achan's actions taught us about sin. There's a sense in which just the first couple of verses here will enable us to expand a little bit on some of that. One thing we can recognize is simply that so much of sin is about short-term thinking. And that is the essence of the temptation for Achan. Take it now. If Achan had just waited, he would have got it in the end because that's God's instructions here at Ai. And that is still true today, right through to now. Satan wants us to think about right now, not about consequences. Do it now, don't wait, just go for it. That is frequently his source of temptation. Right from Adam and Eve, we thought about Adam and Eve last week as a kind of parallel with Achan. Same idea. It looks good, feels good, just eat it. Don't think about the consequences, just go for it now. Satan hides the consequences from them, seeking to get them to think simply in short term. What is it that looks good now? What seems good now? What will feel good now? And forget tomorrow. Don't worry about that at all. That is essentially that is at the heart of so much temptation and sin. Short-term thinking. What is it that feels right now? And forget the consequences. That's just for another time. And that's essentially what you see in Achan. At Jericho, he steals, he takes those things, and there are consequences from that. Had he just waited, had he tried to see a bigger picture, actually the things that he was after would have come to him in the end, which is what happens at Ai, which what makes chapter 7 look even more pointless and tragic. It didn't have to happen. Achan just couldn't wait. So if part of sin is about short-term thinking, there's another thing that seems to highlight here is sin is also usually about putting ourselves in the place of God. You could ask quite rightly, why is it that God changes the plan? Why is it that at Jericho everything has to be given to him, whereas at Ai part of it can go to the people as their spoil? I think in the end it's simply that God owns everything anyway. So Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So if ultimately everything belongs to God, then he can choose what to do with the spoil. He can choose whether to share the spoil with the people or not, simply because it was always his from the start. Which means that when Achan took it for himself at Jericho, he is basically putting himself in the place of God. So God is saying, okay, this is my property, I own this, and in this case I'm asking to keep it. It should go into the treasury. What Achan is saying when he takes it for himself is basically, God might want this, but I feel I have the right to take it. He is acting as if those things are his own to do with what he wants, which is taking a prerogative that belongs to God alone. And you can see that prerogative exercised by God here at Ai, because God says, all this spoil is due to me, everything is mine anyway, but here I will let you take these things, which God can do because the earth is the Lord and everything in it. And what Achan does in the previous chapter is put himself in place of God and decide that he is the one who has authority to decide what to do with those particular things. And again, putting ourselves in the place of God is the essence of sin. So even just in the first couple of verses, we're starting to get a different perspective on what happened in chapter 7. Now, in many ways, like I say, that is just to expand on chapter 7. But there's a second key idea in here, which then points forwards, and is something we need to highlight, thinking about how chapter 8 pans out, which is, there you go there. I was just thinking, everything changes in chapter 8. They win the victory. And you could ask the question, why do they win such a tremendous victory here at Ai? Now, it would be easy at this point to expand on the military strategy that they use and the clever ambush strategy that is designed and implemented to defeat the city of Ai. And it's God's plan. God says to use that ambush. However, I can't help wondering if to talk too much about the ambush strategy and the military strategy involved will be to miss the point, in the sense that the chapter explains how they win. And that strategy gives us a good indication, it gives us a good narrative as to how they win the battle. But why they win, I think, is a different question. And that's answered here in this chapter, in these first two verses. How they win is through the use of ambush. Why they win is not because their strategy is so good. Why they win is because God has given the city into their hands. That's what the verses say. The military strategy is a good one, there's no doubt about that, but victory in all of these battles in Joshua is not about good military strategy. Go back to chapter 6, where they try and conquer Jericho by walking around it and making lots of noise. That is ridiculous in military terms, but utterly successful for the people. Or go back to chapter 5, where they march into the land and promptly incapacitate their entire army by circumcising them, which is nonsensical in military terms, but completely logical in spiritual terms. Because the battle is not about good strategy. It's about fighting the battle that God has commanded them to fight. Or remember, again in chapter 5, Joshua's meeting with the commander of the army of the Lord. Joshua asks him, whose side are you on? Are you for us or for our enemy? And gets this kind of cryptic answer that the commander of the army of the Lord is on God's side. And I think essentially what he's saying is when the people walk with God, he will fight for them, God's forces will fight for them, and they will conquer. And when the people rebel against God, this figure will not be fighting for them, and they will be defeated. And that's what we've seen at Jericho and at Ai, and then at Ai again. In a sense, the war doesn't have to do with good military strategy, even if there is good strategy applied here in this chapter. It has everything to do with God going with them and fighting for them. And hence you get in verse 2 here, I have given them into your hand. It's past tense. They haven't even sent out the army to fight, and God is already talking about their victory in the past tense. I have given them into your hand. So how do they win? They win through this clever strategy and tactics of the ambush. Why do they win? Because God's decided. God has given the city into their hands, and God has said it will happen. And so it's going to happen. Now, the question behind that is, why does God do that? And that's what we have this overlap between what we're thinking of this evening and what we thought about this morning in Jonah. Because God is a God of second chances. Because God does not hold grudges. Because he is a God of mercy and of grace and of forgiveness. And he has no equal in that. He has no equal in mercy or grace or forgiveness. The sin is dealt with, the people are moving forwards, and God is leading them. And in a sense, although we read in this not as Jews in ancient Near East, we're reading this as Christians in the 21st century, we of all people should most understand what's happening here. Because we understand the extent that God went to so that we could be forgiven. The God of grace and mercy and forgiveness allowed his own son, Jesus, to die for us and to sacrifice himself for us. We see the lengths that God went to enable forgiveness to take place. We make mistakes. We rebel. We disobey. We run like Jonah. We grasp for what isn't ours like Achan. And we deserve punishment. And Jesus took that punishment for us. Achan died for his own sin. We don't have to because someone else already has, Jesus. And so that the whole chapter, in a sense, is about coming back from mistakes, being restored to God's path, God picking up his people and using them again. And reading this in the light of the New Testament, none of that should be a surprise to us, for anyone who knows Jesus. In a sense, it should give us confidence for our own lives. Yes, we make mistakes, but God's capacity for faithfulness and forgiveness is always bigger if we just return to him. And in these two chapters, God wants to emphasize these lessons. And so there are two markers, both the narrative about this battle at Ai splits into two halves in chapters 7 and 8. And both sections end with a large pile of stones, which are still there when the author of Joshua writes these words. So chapter 7, verse 26, talking about a pile of stones that covers Achan, says this, "And they raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day." When they conquer Ai, a similar thing happens. The king is taken, he's captured, he's killed. Chapter 8, verse 29, "And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset Joshua commanded, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it to the entrance of the gate of the city and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day." So you have chapters 7 and 8, two great heaps of stones. Same language, great heap of stones that remains to this day. One pile, that covers Achan, bears witness to the consequences of disobedience and rebellion. Another pile that covers the body of the king of Ai bears witness to the fact that with God there is the possibility of forgiveness and restoration. And you have these two markers, and the writer's saying that even now when I'm writing these words, those piles are still there. You can still go and see these two stones that bear witness, the consequences of disobedience and rebellion, but the one that testifies to the fact that with God we can be restored and we can move forwards. And again, this shouldn't be a surprise to us as Christians. We don't have two piles of stones to look at. We have something far greater. We have bread and wine this morning, which is there to keep the memory fresh for us of an even greater forgiveness and restoration that we have received. So Joshua leads the army. They conquer Ai. The king of Ai is killed. And a pile of stones is built up over him as a witness to the fact that God forgives, God restores, God takes his people, and God does new things with them, takes them forward as he wants to. Now, as if that wasn't enough, the passage we have there in Joshua 8 ends with a section which is too important to neglect. So I want to read this whole section. I know we sort of skimmed over the conflict, but I think this is worth focusing in on. So Joshua chapter 8 and verse 30. Yes, there we go. Okay. Joshua 8 verse 30. "At that time, Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as it is written in the book of Moses, the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones upon which no man has wielded an iron tool. And they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And there, in the presence of the people of Israel, he wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. And all Israel, sojourner as well as native born, with their elders and officers and their judges, stood on the opposite sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded at the first to bless the people of Israel. And afterward he read all the words of the law and the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones and the sojourners who lived among them. So most of this chapter is sort of tracing this narrative of you have Jericho, then defeat at Ai, then victory at Ai. And all of a sudden, in verse 30, we're sort of jumped 20 miles away to these two mountains which are quite close together, Ebal and Gerizim. And again, this isn't the scene we might have necessarily expected. You've just won this tremendous victory at Ai. The army which was discouraged after defeat in chapter 7 is now encouraged after victory in chapter 8. What is the logical thing to do now you've taken this strategic piece of land? You press on and you carry on with your war of conquest. That is not what happens. What they do is stop, take all the people 20 miles north to these two mountains, build an altar and read the law, which again reminds us that the book of Joshua isn't just about the Hebrews kicking the Canaanites out of the land. This is ultimately about God's people coming into God's land and being in a place where they can worship him. And so stopping to build an altar before you carry on with your campaign of conquest is entirely appropriate. And it's also an act of obedience. In Deuteronomy 27, Moses had given some very specific instructions about the fact that people were to go to this place and build an altar and read the law. The place isn't chosen at random. There's a photo of from Mount Ebal looking across to Mount Gerizim. The two mountains are quite close together. This is look in the reverse direction. And actually the one, Mount Ebal, does have on the side of it, still there, a kind of natural amphitheatre. People have tried it. You can stand on one, and if you read in a loud voice, actually the way that your voice projects and carries is remarkable. The idea that Joshua could have stood on the mountain and read the law might sound like, how on earth would you do that? But actually the natural geography of the place does make that feasible. But it's more than just the geography and capacity to read and to share. The two mountains are right close together, but in between them is the town of Shechem that sits in the valley in between those two mountains. Now Shechem is important. Shechem is where Abraham received the promise of the land back in Genesis chapter 12. Shechem is where Jacob set up the altar when he returned to the land in Genesis 33. This is a symbolic location for the people. This is where Abraham was first told, your descendants will inherit the land. And now the people gather together at this place, the same place where Abraham received that promise. And the first public reading of the law is here. It's like it's coming home. It has come home. The law has now come home. This is the moment to remind the people of their identity. Who are they? They're God's people. They're reading God's law. They renew the covenant, affirm their commitment to it, standing in the place where God first promised Abraham these things would happen. And now they're here, not just as the family of Abraham, but as an entire nation. And you notice who takes part in this process, this ceremony. The writer emphasizes it. Verse 33, all Israel, sojourner as well as native born, with their elders and officers and their judges. And then verse 35, all the assembly of Israel and the women and the little ones and the sojourners who lived among them. Everybody, everyone who is associated with Israel at this point is there, including the foreigners, those who are foreign born, wherever they came from, whether out of Egypt or picked up along the way. Rahab and her family would have been here participating in this. Achan and his family were not, because they had been killed in chapter 7. There's a sense in which, what is the writer trying to emphasize to us? What is it that matters here? It's not simply a question of ethnicity. Were you born a Hebrew or not? The question is, are you obedient? Those who obey God, those are the ones who are there, committing themselves to it. And the writer emphasizes it. Twice he tells us, sojourner as well as native born. It's not just about ethnicity. It's about obeying God. Now, this idea of kind of covenant renewal actually occurs more than once in Joshua. In one sense, it sort of happens back in chapter 5 when the males are circumcised. You get it here, this sort of idea of covenant renewal. Joshua does some slight tweaks to change the pattern that Moses set in Deuteronomy 27. In Deuteronomy 27, it talks about both blessings and curses. This passage here emphasizes more the blessings, possibly because they've just been defeated at Ai, and so the consequences of the curses are well known for them. But also Joshua seems to take more of a lead here. It's almost reminiscent of Mount Sinai, where Moses goes up as a representative of the people, he receives the law. And then here at this mount, Joshua is the one who takes the lead and reads out the law and interprets it and describes it for the people. You get another sort of covenant renewal running ahead into chapter 24, towards the end of the book of Joshua. And the interesting thing is, each time the people are in a sort of a new situation. Here, they've just entered the land. They've come to Shechem for the first time. They've just conquered this location. They can read the law and celebrate this in the place where Abraham received that initial promise. They've not long been here, and they've just only won a few battles. There's a newness to it. When you get to the end of the book and you have the covenant renewal in Joshua 24, Joshua's about to die. It's really the last thing Joshua does in his life. In chapter 24, you have this Joshua speech to the people, a covenant renewal, and then Joshua dies and is buried. There's a sense in which each of them, they're points of change, points of real distinction and change and transition. Now, in one sense, the whole idea of kind of covenant renewal is not something that we're maybe not that familiar with. But I think we might be more familiar with this than we realize. When we talk about covenants, I guess the most common parallel we use in our culture now is marriage. A covenant that exists in our culture now is marriage. But the idea of renewing marriage vows isn't an unusual one for us. It's one that does happen. We're familiar with that. People do renew their marriage vows. It's not that the couple had realized actually they were never married in the first place and so have to do something to get married. They were. Their marriage was real and true and genuine. And hopefully it's not because they're thinking of getting a divorce. Things are going really badly. What do? Let's renew our vows and that will cure everything. I don't think that's the idea either. I think it's simply that why do you renew your marriage vows? I wonder if it's just that life moves on. Things change. Your life changes. Your context changes. The couple got married when they were young and they were single and healthy, and now they're older. And kids have been born, they've grown, they've left, they've gone. They were healthy when they got married, but there have been health problems that have been faced, maybe still facing health problems. And so in that context, you choose to renew your vows. Not because you're afraid of getting a divorce, not because you weren't actually married, but because your life has changed. Things have changed. The context has changed. And so you decide to renew and reaffirm your commitment to each other. And you say, that our life is different. The situation we're in now is different to when we first made that commitment and entered into that covenant of marriage. But what we're doing by reaffirming our vows is to say our commitment hasn't changed. Our context may have changed. The challenges we're facing may have changed. But our commitment to each other hasn't changed. And so you renew vows to kind of reaffirm that commitment, but in a new context. The commitment's the same, but the context has changed. And that, I think, is what has happened here in this section. The people who have lived their lives in the wilderness have now come into the promised land. That things have changed. Things aren't what they were before. And it's an appropriate time to stop and say, we still are committed to God's plan. And then you run to the end of the book, and what's happening? Joshua is about to die. There's another transition taking place. There'll be a new leadership. As we know, looking back, they're moving from Joshua as a leader to a time of judges. And so it's appropriate again to say, look, our commitment hasn't changed. We're still committed to God. We want to renew our commitment to him. Our commitment hasn't changed. Our context has, our situation has. The challenges we're facing have changed, but our commitment to God has not changed. And so they stop and they renew the covenant, renew their commitment. Now, if that's what's happening here, the question then is whether that has any application to us today. And I was wondering I think there can be value in taking moments to renew our commitment to God. And I say that because I think that's happened to me a few times. Again, not because I'm doubting my salvation and want to kind of go back over that again. I think it's because, a bit like Israel, sometimes life changes. And you face challenges that you haven't faced before. So living in the UK, but then choosing to move to Peru. I know that my life is going to be hugely different. It's going to be a whole new set of challenges and problems and obstacles to be faced. But you renew that commitment and say, I know things are changing, God, but I'm sticking with you. I want to follow you and do what you want me to do. Other changes, when our kids are born, moving to the UK, another huge change. My life and my context change, and I find myself in a different place to before, but I renew the commitment and say, God, I'm still committed to you. I want to follow you. My life is very different now to what it was when I lived in Peru, different to what it was when I lived in the UK, massively different to what my life was when I became a Christian at age 4 or 5. And as these things change, I want to reaffirm, my commitment hasn't changed. I'm in a different situation, with different challenges, a different language, a culture, people, whatever. But actually, God, you are consistent, and I want to reaffirm my commitment to you. And I think, when I looked at that, I thought, there has been value for myself in taking time now and again to stop and to reflect, and to understand how much my life has changed, how much God has done in my life, and to reaffirm my commitment to God and desire to serve him moving forwards. And I think that has been helpful for me periodically to kind of do that and to stop and to reflect. Now, the difference here is this is an entire nation, which set me thinking, if I can do that as an individual, what about corporately? Can we do it as a church, a kind of covenant renewal type thing? Now, again, I say when we moved to Peru, we hadn't lived in Peru very long, and we realized that pretty much every church knew when they had been planted and how old they were. So our church in Trujillo celebrated its anniversary every 8th of October. So you knew that as a start, a fixed point in our church calendar. 8th of October, which in Peru is a bank holiday, which helps, that's our church anniversary. And every year we stopped as a church to celebrate, to reflect and celebrate everything that's gone on, to reflect on God's faithfulness in the past, and to think of all that God has done for us as a church. But it was also an opportunity to look forward to the future and to think, where is God taking us now? This is the journey we've been on as a church. Where are we going now? What's God doing? And kind of to reaffirm our commitment to that path. Recognizing something of what it requires of us as a church, the faithfulness it requires of us. We know God is faithful to us, but actually we need to commit ourselves to the path God's taking us on, and to reaffirm our commitment to God. And I don't think we ever phrased it in terms of kind of covenant renewal, but we did in some way take part as a church in a process of renewing our commitment to God and the path that he was taking us on. And that was kind of quite normal for lots of churches in Peru. Everyone knew when your church was founded, when the anniversary was, and every year that was a fixed part of our church calendar. I don't know if it's similar. Tim alluded to something similar in Romania, where he mentioned going for the 100th anniversary of that church. I've never come across anything quite like that in the UK. I wonder if maybe a couple of church weekends that I've been asked to share on and speak at. In each of those cases, the church leaders, ahead of that, when I was speaking to them saying, what do you want, what sort of things do you want me to share on? In each case, the church leaders said something that's going to re-envision our church and build us up and motivate us for the future. So there is an element of kind of a renewal of our commitment. What is the path that God has got for us? Where is he taking us as a church? God's committed to us. Are we going to commit to God and say, yes, we want to walk this path with you, God. You lead, we'll follow you. Things have changed. Life has changed. Culture changes. Society changes. Our church has changed. But we're still committed to you. We want to follow you where you lead and follow that path. So that whole idea of, even as a church, is there a sense in which we can maybe kind of renew our commitment to God and say, we recognize that you're leading. We want to follow and we commit ourselves to you. Now, here in Joshua 8, you have that at this point. I think not just because of all that's taken place in terms of the people arriving into the land, But I think it's also just maybe the sense in their mind that they had failed in a big way in chapter 7. Achan had taken these things. The people had lost that battle. They'd lost soldiers in conflict. They had failed. And so having won this victory at Ai, what is the logical thing to do? Militarily, strategically, the logical thing is to fight the next battle. But actually for them, spiritually as a people, the next thing to do is actually to stop, to go to Shechem, to stand in this place, to stand on these mountains, to obey what Moses asked them to do in Deuteronomy, and to renew their covenant. They had failed, but God's been faithful to them. And when Joshua reads that list of curses for disobedience, they fully understand what that means because they've just seen it in their own lives in the last few weeks and their recent past. But also when Joshua reads that list of blessings, they now understand maybe even more fully the nature of the God that they are following. A God who requires obedience, but also a God of forgiveness and of mercy. And so, like I say, we also can reflect on our past. But when we reflect on our past, above all else, we reflect on the life of Jesus, who took the punishment for our failure and brought us into God's family. And we recognize that God requires obedience of us today as well. That much hasn't changed, but thankfully neither has God's character. Failure will mark our lives as well. But the God of faithfulness and mercy and grace is still able to help us past that, to live the lives that he wants us to do, and to use us in ways that maybe we could never have imagined. Now, we're going to break into groups for a minute, and break into groups in a minute, and there's some questions to have a think about. And I'll pray before we do that. But I just thought it might be helpful just maybe to leave a couple of minutes, or no, not minutes, a short moment of silence. Just with that same idea in mind, Israel had been through these challenges and took the time to renew their covenant with God. I just wonder if it might be helpful just to leave a few moments just to reflect ourselves, to thank God for what he has done in our lives, and maybe to recognize what it is he's calling us to now. He's calling you to as an individual, and to take the chance to commit yourself again to that path, to commit to following God's path wherever he takes us, whatever that involves. So I'll just leave a few moments of silence, and then I'll pray, and then we'll go into groups, and I've got a couple of questions to think through. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your grace and your mercy and your faithfulness shown to Jonah in our message this morning, shown to Israel here, but most of all shown to us. We thank you most of all for Jesus, that greatest example of faith and mercy and grace and forgiveness, opening the way to become part of your family. We thank you for him. We thank you that you are the same God that acted in the lives of Joshua and the people then, and we thank you for the immense way you've acted in our lives. We recognize that you are a God that still requires obedience of us. You're a God that still wants to lead us, wants to use our lives. We recognize that you do call us to follow you. We know that we make mistakes, we fail, we're stumbling at times. We thank you that forgiveness is there. We ask that you'd help us to draw back to you in these moments, and to seek to be restored, and we ask that you would give us the strength and the courage and the perseverance and the commitment to walk in the paths that you are taking us on, to fulfill the calling you place on each of our lives, to let you work through us and in us, to be the people you would want us to be, to become those people, and also to shape the world in which you've placed us, working out your plan for this world. We want to renew our commitment to you and say that this is what we want to do with our lives. We want our lives to mean something, and to mean something for your plan, to be lived in a way that pleases you and enables you to do all that you want to do through us. So we commit ourselves again to you, and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.